Hey guys, this is Lala Legacy and welcome back to Pale Cachexia. So before we jump in, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button because that would mean the whole world to me. And after this video, if you like it, hit the like button too. Alright, let's jump in. Esther? Esther, are you alright? After they'd finished washing the dishes and wandered back into the parlor, Sienna gave Esther a curious, slightly worried look. I think you could use some rest. You look really tired. You did work very hard today. She couldn't deny Sienna's observation. It was becoming steadily more of a struggle to keeping her eyes open, and her muscles ached from so much unexpected use. You're right. I should sleep, so I'll have the energy to go through the study more properly tomorrow. You should rest too, Sienna. Yes, of course! We should be able to go through the chores more quickly tomorrow too, since you're an expert now. Well, I'll see you in the morning then, Esther. Sleep well. After pausing for a short moment, she gave a playful little curtsy with a smile, to which Esther nodded in response. But as she started to turn towards the stairs, Sienna hesitated again, glancing back at Esther somewhat shyly. Esther? You probably aren't very comfortable, right? I mean, you're wearing your normal day clothes to sleep. The thought had barely crossed her mind, but Sienna was right. Her traveling outfit wasn't exactly the most pleasant thing to rest in. I think you're too big for any of my clothes, but if you'd like, I could give you one of Papa's old shirts to wear at night. He was really tall, so it would be like a nightgown for you. Only if it's no trouble. No, not at all. If you're going to be staying here for a little while, it makes sense, doesn't it? You can't be wearing the same thing all the time. Anyway, I'll be right back. Stay there just a moment. Taking off in what was almost a sprint, she bounded to the stairs, vanishing up them the next moment. Esther barely had to wait a minute before she heard returning footsteps and spotted Sienna fluttering through the foyer like a white rabbit. And here we are! She unfurled a huge black shirt from beneath her arm, flourishing it like a grand cape. Esther tentatively reached out for the shirt. Even though it was probably silly of her, she couldn't shake a sense of guilt, agreeing to wear something that belonged to a person so recently deceased. Sienna's father, no less. Well, you can go change in the kitchen if you'd like. I'll wait here. The same feeling didn't seem to bother Sienna, who gave Esther an eager, nearly impatient smile. All right. After a brief pause, she relented, moving to retreat into the kitchen. It was quite chilly away from the fire, so Esther undressed quickly, goosebumps raising on her arms as soon as she unbuttoned her blouse. Once her clothes were hastily folded up beside her, she pulled the shirt over her head, immediately thankful for the loose warmth it provided. How does it look? She wandered back into the living room, hesitantly shifting her gaze over to Sienna. The soft, loose fabric hung over Esther's frame like an oversized dress, her arms lost in the flowing sleeves. It smelled remarkably clean. Sienna must have kept washing her father's clothes all these years. Wow! It really suits you, Esther. Just like a cozy nightgown. Sienna gasped with delight, clasping her hands together and beaming brightly. You weren't lying about it being big. She raised one arm to study her dangling sleeve, feeling somewhat embarrassed about how ridiculous she must have looked. Still, she had to admit it was much cozier than her blouse and skirt. It also made Esther feel a little more at home, instead of a wanderer simply staying overnight. Thank you, Sienna. I promise I'll take good care of it. Aw, you don't need to be so formal, Esther. It's only just a shirt. But I'm happy that you like it. Papa was always very practical, so I think he'd be glad to know his clothes are being put to good use again. A gentle smile crossed Sienna's features, carrying a trace of both sadness and warm affection. Well, now that you've got something nicer to sleep in, I suppose it's bedtime. Good night, Esther. Sleep well. Good night, Sienna. Thank you again. When they parted ways and Sienna's bedroom door had softly clicked shut upstairs, Esther lowered herself onto the couch once more. It was her second night here, but already it was starting to feel like something of a pleasant routine. Pleasant. If not for what always had to preface her sleep. Reaching down for where her satchel still rested on the floor, Esther pulled out the small silver watch from before. Reluctantly but methodically, she flicked the switch and pushed the needle into her arm, siphoning out her blood before forcing the altered compound back into her vein. Around and around the hands spun until they marked a full day's worth of hours. The syringe slipped free from her skin, leaving only a few beads of deep red behind. It was difficult to describe the strange, sickly discomfort she felt during and after the process. At first, there was a modicum of relief, a pleasant buzz that distracted her from the injection. But within a few moments, it swiftly turned into nauseating weight in the pit of her stomach, a feeling like something alien and unwanted had begun circling in her bloodstream. She had to keep doing it for now. One day, she'd no longer be dependent on the loathsome thing. But she could only dream of when that day would finally come. Curling her legs up on the sofa, Esther huddled beneath her blankets. She felt far more comfortable in Isaiah's shirt, though it hardly mattered considering how deeply tired she was. Before long, a warmth of a well-deserved sleep began to drown out all of her thoughts. The weight on her mind steadily cleared, fading into a muddy haze, until at last she was pulled into the timeless world of dreams. How are there so many of these accursed things? Oh, wiping the sweat from his brow with a forearm, the man sighed heavily. Is that Isaiah? He was only halfway through planting his potatoes, one of the staple crops he'd planned. They were taking him much longer than expected, and it was far from an enjoyable process. With all of the work I've put into this patch, I expect some damn fine produce to come out of it. It is, Isaiah, he announced sharply to the freshly tilled earth around him, which currently only offered a few sparse seedlings. Still, despite all his annoyance and grumbling, Isaiah couldn't deny the satisfaction he felt from surveying his work. Between the garden and the newly renovated manor, his old family grounds were becoming a beautiful, independent refuge in the forest. At last, he would be free from the will of others, free from all the rules, structures, and arbitrary games of society. It was well worth the price of being completely alone. Except you have your daughter. Well, not entirely alone. Isaiah's gaze flicked towards the small figure sitting in the grass nearby, toying with flowers and giggling with wonder at the sky. This scene was one he'd longed for so many times. Only in his dreams, she was here too. Laughing and holding their child, the sunlight glittering on their matching hair. Without her, it seemed like nothing more than a sad joke, the caricature of a clueless father played for a fool by his beloved. "And what a fool I am," he muttered bitterly to himself, tossing his shovel aside and rubbing a hand across his brow. "Stuck with a child I've no clue how to care for. Out here gardening and laboring, when I'm nothing but a witless academic who inadvertently slew all of the houseplants by forgetting to water them. I've gotten myself into quite the mess this time, haven't I?" His chest heaved with a long, tired sigh. As much as he tried to convince himself that this was the right choice, that he'd be happier out here than in the city, a sense of doubt always came creeping back to him. And, like it had for many years, the pail's icy grip still held him in its clutches. Earlier in the year, when he was cleaning and refurbishing the manor for his new family, Isaiah had barely felt the symptoms. A wealth of energy flowed through him, and all of his lethargy was washed away by tides of excitement. But now, he couldn't rouse himself from bed half the time, and the disease attacked him savagely when he least expected it. His last true hope for living, the only thing giving him the will to fight the Pale's onslaught, was his search for a cure. Though he could feel that hope beginning to wane too. "Papa?" The man jerked his head towards the source of that tiny voice. He kept forgetting she was even there, playing among the flowers. But when he looked down at the child, he saw her tiny hand outstretched towards him. A little white blossom lay in the center of her palm, offered up to him alongside a sunny, guileless smile. Reluctantly, the man lowered down to one knee. With hesitant, uncertain fingers, he reached out to take her offering, holding it in his much larger palm. "Papa, Papa!" The girl delightedly clapped her hands, breaking into a happy fit of giggles. Isaiah watched her for several long moments, his face contorting slightly, as if it wasn't fully sure what expression to make. "What a silly girl. Like a damned babbling brook you are. Silence is a virtue, especially for children." You know, I can't help but notice how much Esther looks like Isaiah. I wonder if there's something there. Grumbling quietly, he shoved the white flower into his pocket, then reached out to pick up his shovel once more. There was still a great deal of planting to be done. He had to take advantage of days like today when he had the strength to work properly. No time to be playing around with flowers, certainly. With that, he set about digging again, driving his shovel into the soft earth with vehement strikes. What a strange life he had created for himself. Strange, solitary, and most likely a very difficult one indeed. There was much he had to learn, and not simply for academic curiosity, but for their survival. It was a heavy pressure, unforgiving and merciless as nature itself. nor was he a young, fit man full of vigorous energy any longer, able to finish 100 tasks in one day. But somehow he couldn't imagine going back to how life was before. Even if he never became a skilled farmer or a decent carpenter or an adept tailor, at least he was forging his path with his own two hands. As long as he retained that endless freedom, cherished it, grew bolder in it, and one day, perhaps even passed it down to her, he could surely carry any weight on his shoulders along the way. A distant rumble stirred Esther from her sleep. Her hazy, half-open eyes drifted towards the window, where a dull sky greeted her with a little morning light. Heavy raindrops sluggishly coursed down the glass, forming jagged patterns that soon dissolved into nothingness. The grayness brought back her memories of the city. Dim, cold dawns filtering through her bedroom window, minutes spent staring out past the smoking chimneys into the industrial fog that always clouded her view. Mornings where it felt like an immense struggle to will herself upward, to muster the strength for starting a new day. She could hear her parents down below, their muffled voices greeting each other cheerfully over tea and breakfast. But as much as she clearly wanted to join them, or dearly wanted to join them, the longer she lay there listening to their light chatter, the more she felt removed from them altogether. A sense of loneliness so deep that it grew complacent, resigned to the fact that she would never again rejoin the unafflicted world. And the more she dwelled on that sullen thought, the less Esther felt like she wanted to rejoin such a world at all. Until finally, a restless sleep slowly would come to cover her in darkness once more. Esther, are you awake? Her eyelids fluttered open again. When she jerked her head upwards, she saw Sienna standing beside the sofa, looking down at her rather timidly. Oh, I'm sorry if I woke you up. I just thought I'd make some tea, so I was checking if I should put on a bigger pot for the two of us. Despite her light smile, something in Sienna's tone seemed to carry a hint of worry. Almost automatically, Esther slowly pushed herself into a sitting position. She barely realized it until her bare feet brushed the floor, sending a faint shiver up her spine. It's fine. I was already awake. Thank you for checking on me. Oh, of course. Sienna looked relieved, nodding contentedly to Esther's words. Tea for two, then. I'll go put on the kettle. Oh, and I thought we could stay inside today. I normally do on rainy days. We could go over Papa's books and research together, maybe, if I wouldn't bother you. I'd be grateful for your help, Sienna. There are so many books and papers, I barely know where to start. Yes, of course. I'd be happy to help. I'm so excited. Oh, but first things first, the tea. I'll go fix a pot that's perfect for a day like this. If you don't mind, could you start the fire and light a few candles, Esther? There's a tinder box on the in the desk by the window. With that, she turned to hurry off into the kitchen, the soft pattering of her footsteps buried beneath the drone of heavy rain. Again, in an unconscious movement, Esther found herself rising from her nest of blankets with little effort. It caught her off guard. Normally, her illness left her all but catatonic on overcast days. Perhaps her consciousness around Sienna was an even stronger force than her deep lethargy. Either way, it seemed best not to question it. I'm sorry, guys, I'm getting so emotional because literally how Esther is like, her symptoms and everything is literally my life, and I'm seeing it right in front of me. After changing into her day clothes and fishing out the tinderbox Sienna mentioned, Esther knelt down to kindle the fireplace. As soon as it flickered to life, filling the room with a warm light and steady crackling, she felt like a spark of energy lit inside her, too. So strange, how only a small fire could make such a difference. When Sienna returned, she proudly held a fine silver tray in her hands. Along with tea, she brought 2 bowls of the granola she'd freshly made, a deliciously comforting breakfast alongside their warm drinks. They sat down on the sofa to munch together, watching the rain torrent down in sheets past the window pane. It was one of those heavy, blanketing storms that made a person grateful to have shelter, nurturing some deep instinct to curl up inside and wait for the rain to pass. Sitting together for an unhurried meal, reassured by the warm fire and pattering raindrops that all was safe. It was a simple pleasure, but the more she dwelled on it, the more Esther found a calm, reassuring satisfaction in the moment. At one point, Sienna giggled faintly, to which Esther gave her a puzzled glance. "You were making a really cute, charming face just now. Like a little cat after it just finished a saucer of cream." Esther hastily raised her mug and took a long sip of tea, taking refuge behind the painted ceramic. "Oh, I'm not teasing you. I know I make funny faces too. It just makes me happy to see you like that since when you first arrived. You looked so hollow." "Hollow?" Sienna nodded, lowering her gaze to where she grasped her warm mug in both hands. "Yes, hollow. Like you didn't have anything left, I suppose." From her suddenly reluctant, almost wary reply, it almost seemed as if she was familiar with such a look. She could have been imagining things, but Esther thought she saw Sienna shudder faintly, drawing closer to the fireplace. "Well, since we're both finished, I think I'll go wash up." She hopped up to her feet, stacking their bowls together atop the tray. "All right, I'll go upstairs and look for some books to bring down." "Oh, yes! You can light the candles up there if you want, since it's so dark. I'll meet you back here in a bit then." With that, Sienna swiveled to make her way towards the kitchen, her tray rattling softly. Her retreat seemed a little hastier than normal. Esther had the sense she was still bothered by something, perhaps the comment she'd made earlier about looking hollow. Despite her warm friendliness, Sienna had a certain guarded side to her, a private shield and degree of separation that Esther hadn't expected. It might fade eventually, if they grew to know each other better. But right now, Esther felt like Sienna was almost keeping her at arm's length in a strange way. After summoning the strength required to leave the warm, cozy fire, Esther forced herself out into the hallway and up the creaky stairs. But when she stepped into the study, just like before, Esther felt an oppressive, bleak atmosphere pressing down around her. In her haste to light the candles, she nearly tripped over her own 2 feet. Their glow didn't wholly alleviate the grim darkness, but it was enough to bring Esther a little relief. Why did this room bother her so much? By all accounts, it simply looked like a normal study, a whole bit a messy one. But there was nothing that should have set her on edge. Exhaling a long sigh, she inwardly mocked herself for her cowardice. She was here to find a cure, not to get caught up in her silly fears of shadows. But the more she glanced around the small library with its overflowing shelves and piles of scattered books and papers, the more daunting her task felt. The only real trail of research that Isaiah left were his scattered writings. Uncovering his studies would have been far easier if they were bound together, not written on individual scraps of parchment. However, if Isaiah went through phases of studying different subjects, perhaps the journal pages stuffed into similar books would form roughly the same period. Would be from roughly the same period of his life. With that hope in mind, Esther returned to the spot she'd found the previous journal entry, scouring intensely over the row of dusty tomes. It didn't take long for her to spot another piece of parchment, this one tucked inside a small leather book. Eagerly pulling it from the shelf, she let the tome fall open in her palms, revealing a short page scribbled in Isaiah's hand. She baffles me, that little girl. Always laughing, always cheerful. Always smiling and patient with me, even after I raise my voice at her. I have only seen her cry once. It happened when I brought her outside this morning, preparing to bring her to the city's orphanage. As if she somehow knew our destination, the girl instantly began to bawl and scream, a dreadful sound that I should hope never to hear again. So dreadful, in fact, that I could not stomach the thought of hearing it for hours, so I was forced to cancel my trip. I suppose I will keep her here for now. When she gets older, she may be useful at cleaning and tending the land with me at least. With any luck, she'll have inherited my work ethic instead of her mother's. Isaiah had mentioned taking Sienna to an orphanage in the last journal she'd read. The two entries must have been written very close together. Her hunch was right. The discovery made her heart leap with excitement, even though it was only a small revelation. But if she could piece together Isaiah's path of studies chronologically, as well as his inner thoughts, she might have a chance at figuring out his approach to a cure. A small note suddenly fluttered out of the back of the book, startling Esther. She bent down to grab it, her eyes drifting over the scribbled writing. Reminder, finish reading and annotating the latest tome on spirits. Any relation to the Pale still seems unlikely, but if all my alchemical and biological studies have been fruitless, what have I to lose? She turned the book over to glance at its cover and spine, but there was no name to be seen. However, when she opened it to its first page, a large title stretched across the parchment in sharp letters. Salmith? A treatise on spirits of shadow. Spirits of shadow? For some reason, as she murmured part of the title aloud to herself, Esther felt a faint chill crawling up her spine. It was only a book on superstition and unfounded claims, surely. But if Isaiah had singled it out, maybe it was still worth scanning through. Wasting not a minute further, she scooped up some of the surrounding books and loose papers on the shelf, cradling them carefully in her arms. But before she left, she had to quickly blow out all the candles, and once the gloomy darkness returned, it seemed even deeper than before. Once she descended the stairs and returned to the warmly lit parlor, Esther exhaled a quiet sigh of relief. Sienna was already waiting on the sofa, huddled up beneath a large, fluffy red blanket. "Hello, Esther. Welcome back." Look at all those books. Here, I'll help you." She sprung off the cushions eagerly, as if Esther's return was a welcome relief for her, too. Together they stacked up the books and papers at one end of the sofa, forming a rather intimidating pile. Sienna, however, didn't seem fazed in the slightest by the tower of texts, and bent down to examine the titles curiously. Natural science, astronomy, alchemy. I don't think I've ever seen any of these before. Oh, wait! This book, I remember this one. Sienna reached for the same book Esther had picked up first, the book on spirits. Yes, Papa was always reading this book and scribbling notes. I asked him about it again and again, but he never told me why he was so obsessed with it. I guess he thought it would frighten me too much. With a soft sigh, she sank back down onto the sofa, still holding the book with a certain reverence. When Esther settled in beside her, Sienna reached out to drape the blanket around the other girl's shoulders. "Thank you, it's cozy." "Isn't it? Reading is a lot better when you're wrapped in a blanket." "Well then, let's see what Papa was fussing over so much. Are you ready?" Holding the book up so that Esther could see the pages, Sienna began to read aloud, focusing on the pages her father had scribbled on the most. Before long, both of them were equally transfixed. In a strange blend of psychology, philosophy, and the supernatural, the author described how different spirits affected one's body and mind in different ways. The term spirits didn't refer solely to departed souls, but rather certain essences of the universe that manifested in concentrated forms. Some could be channeled for purposes like healing, luck, or creative inspiration, but most couldn't be controlled by humans. They would simply pass through the body of their own accord, or as dictated by other factors in the environment. However, as fascinating as it was to consider, Esther listened with a skeptical detachment. With no proof beyond his own research and anecdotal evidence, the author's claims could hardly rival any real scientific study. And, more importantly, Esther couldn't see any real relation to the Pale, at least not in a way that would help her find a cure. Just as she was about to suggest they try a different book, Sienna turned to a new chapter. It only lasted a single page, and the page after it was completely blank. A short warning on the study of the aphoryl. When her eyes roamed across the title, a small shiver ran through her body just like it had earlier. Such a short chapter. That's interesting, don't you think? This author likes using far too many words, so he really must have ran out of ideas for this one. After a small giggle to herself, Sienna cleared her throat before starting to read once more. Though the realm of spirits is infinitely diverse, all those noted thus far have one thing in common. Their energy is ephemeral. They will rarely affect the body for extended periods. However, there is one type of spirit that will not only invade, but overtake a human soul whenever they are given the chance. They are known as I said it before. A Raphael, or a Raphael, shades that lie completely beyond the realm of mortal understanding. I shall not write in detail of them here, For it is said that dwelling on the Afral will often draw them to one's presence, and thus few have dared to document them. Once their attention is garnered, they will lure in their unsuspecting target without remorse, or more precisely, the target will be drawn to them inescapably, without realizing or understanding their own actions. My sole warning, then, is to avoid any study or investigation of these spirits. Do not trifle with the darker workings of nature, no matter how alluring their call may be. Some aspects of the unseen world are meant to remain untouched. After she finished reading, the parlor grew chillingly silent. For a moment, it felt as if the fire's warmth had vanished, and the only thing staving off the cold air was Sienna's small form huddling against Esther. Neither of them immediately spoke. Both of their gazes were still drawn to the single page, lying open beside its empty bone-white twin. Unlike most of the other chapters, where Isaiah had lined the margins with his scribbled comments, this chapter was completely devoid of any such notes. The only mark he'd left was a dark, bold outline beneath the first mention of Arafel. The thick ink blot beside it suggested his pen had lingered there for a time. Either he'd been deliberating about writing more, or else he had simply gotten lost in thought. The Arafel. It's a pretty name, but the way he describes them, it's really eerie. Sienna finally broke the silence, her hesitant voice barely above a whisper. What do you suppose it means, Esther? Could they have something to do with the pail? She offered no reply for a long moment. A murky, uncertain feeling shifted briefly at the back of her mind, before she pushed it away, annoyed at her own bothersome insecurities. I don't believe in whatever he's talking about. Even if spirits like that existed, there's no reason why they'd be related to the pale. It's a disease of the body. You ease the symptoms with a tonic, not with a priest warding off spirits. The more she voiced her thoughts aloud, the more firmly Esther believed them. The lure of superstition had only tempted her in a moment of weakness, in her impatience to find a cure. But I'll still keep looking for Isaiah's notes on them. His research on spirits might have led him somewhere else important. You're right. Maybe Papa found another lead. Something more, sturdy. It was easy to see the doubt on her face. Did Sienna really believe in such things? She was younger, of course, but still far more intelligent and mature than most girls Esther knew. It wasn't simply a case of a naive child being afraid of ghosts. Why, then, would she give any credence to such far-fetched writings? Esther just couldn't understand it. Let's look through something else. Yes, let's! In the brief moment of awkwardness that followed, Sienna cleared her throat a little nervously before pausing with a shy, slightly embarrassed smile. Could I ask you a favor, Esther? I'd really like to read one of Papa's journal pages, but... Well, like I said yesterday, he always told me not to. She twirled a few strands of hair around one finger, letting out a rueful laugh. There were lots of things he was ashamed he'd written, he said, but he didn't want to throw them away. He needed to remember what he'd written and thought about, so that he'd never make the same mistake again. I don't know which journals are ones he wouldn't want me reading, but maybe you could look one over quickly and see? Of course. After briefly hesitating, Esther nodded. She was happy to do anything to repay Sienna's many kindnesses, but after reading Isaiah's past journal entries, They seemed like they might be more painful for Sienna than anything. Picking up a few bound pieces of parchment from the pile, Esther quickly scanned over the pages, searching for any mention of Sienna that might upset the other girl if she read it. Fortunately, though, the entry she'd picked up seemed unrelated to family matters. It looked more like a hastily, angrily scribbled rant, the penmanship even messier than Isaiah's normal writings. This one, shall I read it for us? Ooh, yes, please! Resting her chin on Esther's shoulder, she peered curiously at the frenzied scribbling. With a deep inhale, Esther slowly began to read Isaiah's words aloud. Earlier today, I was reflecting upon my departure from the Academy's medical circle. At the time, it was such a difficult decision, such an agonizing farewell. Now, however, I look back upon those times with awe, wondering how on earth I ever survived in such a place. I was constantly delegating research and experiments to different departments, and yet nearly every completed task would always return to me with some issue. The use of faulty tools or sloppy documentation, contaminated materials, careless omission of important details. It exasperated me to no end. Even the purported finest of researchers with the most spotless of records always seemed to deliver a perfunctory oh no, I said that wrong again. Perfunctory performance. My mind is not reading it correctly. I am having a pretty bad lupus flare today. Then, whenever I would bring my unsatisfying results before the head, he acted as if he didn't care in the slightest. On occasion, he'd echo my complaints with sympathetic tutting and a shake of his head, but in the end, I gathered he simply had no investment in the results. Much of the time, the head went so far as to defend their mistakes, only stopping at the edge of calling me an outright fool for caring as much as I did. Any problems I encountered were mine to resolve. Every issue would be solely mine to bear. Frustration brought me to the edge of breaking down over and over again, and only my damned refusal to concede would pull me back from the brink. And certainly, perhaps, I am far too finical and needlessly worried over fine details. Despite my vanity, I realize I can be hopelessly stubborn at times. But is it such a crime to strive for the best performance one can achieve? To care so passionately for beautiful results, a delicate procedure, a loving attention to detail? Can I rightly be called mad for my longing to make my envisioned perfection into reality? Or, if not perfection, then its very closest sibling, a masterpiece of planning. No, I see now with lucid eyes. Leaving that hive of mediocrity was truly a blessing in disguise. Whatever I can accomplish alone, will no doubt be far smaller in scale than anything I could have done at the Academy. This I realize. But in the end, to be truly pleased with one's work, it must be solely a product of one's own design. And somehow it brings me an odd, unexpected comfort in these long days of solitary research and study, knowing I shall have no one to blame but myself when I am dissatisfied. To Esther's surprise, as soon as she finished reading, Sienna broke out into warm, delighted laughter. It just sounds so much like Papa, the little rants he would always go on about over dinner. He always took himself and his work really impossibly seriously. Never any slacking, always beating himself up over his mistakes. It brings back so many memories. Slowly, the bright, affectionate smile on her face began to wane. She seemed to be struggling to keep herself cheery in the face of whatever she'd remembered, but it appeared to be a losing battle. Sienna, your father... Hesitating, Esther bit her lip. You don't have to answer, but could I ask what happened to him? I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked. No, it's fine. Sienna reached out, placing her small hand on Esther's arm reassuringly. In a way, the faint smile she wore seemed almost grateful, as if it was something she'd wanted to talk about but hadn't been able to bring up. At first, I didn't realize he was gone. That morning, I woke up and started the day like usual, making a meal for both of us. I put Papa's on a little tray and brought it upstairs, planning to leave it outside his door, tell him I loved him, then go start my chores. But... An involuntary shudder went through her, briefly interrupting her halting, quiet words. When I reached his study, I saw the door was open. For a moment, I was so happy. I thought he was finally recovering, and he could come play with me and work outside again. But he wasn't in his study, or anywhere in the manor, or outside in the garden. It was like he just vanished into thin air. When I realized Papa had disappeared, I was so scared. For 3 days, all I did was search for him everywhere I could. I didn't return to the manor at all. I only ate some berries and roots, drank from the stream, and slept on leaf beds. But I never found anything, not a single trace. But that is all the time that I have for this episode, guys. So if you liked it, hit that like button down below, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button too. I love you guys so much, and I will see you next time. Bye!